Last summer, I made my sister an extra special birthday cake, so today we're gonna look at how I made this intricate and super fun birthday treat. Hi there, foodie friends. My name is Carly, and welcome back to my channel, Adventures in Yum. To start, we're whipping up the base of the birthday cake. My sister doesn't really like cake and prefers other desserts like brownies or cookies, so I like to use her birthday to experiment with turning other desserts into birthday cake. For this year, I decided to make a sheet cake with the base being made of brownies. I really like the way sweetened condensed milk brownie cookies turn out, so I decided to play around with a sweetened condensed milk brownie recipe. I'm not sharing that recipe here because I still need to play around with it a little bit. The texture was closer to a rich chocolatey fudge rather than a fudgy brownie, so while still super yummy and definitely enjoyed, a little bit of adjusting is in order. My sister loves toffee, so I also added some toffee bits to the brownie batter. After mixing up the brownie batter, I added it to a parchment paper lined sheet pan, baked it, pressed down the slightly raised sides as soon as it came out of the oven to make the brownies have a more even and flat top, and finally let it completely cool. After the brownies were mostly cool, I whipped up some of my cookie butter salted caramel. I poured it across the top of the brownie slab and smoothed it out using an offset spatula. After letting it set for a while, I covered the top of the tray with plastic wrap and chilled it in the refrigerator. Next, we're working on the longest part of this process, the decorations, of course. I taped a couple pieces of paper together and then used a pencil and parts of the classic game board to create a template. I traced around some parts of the game board so it would start in the middle and then go along the perimeter. I also used a couple pieces from the board to trace the shapes onto the game board template as well. Then I drew some short lines to divide the game path as well as wrote what each section of the path represented. Once the template was complete, I used a thick black Sharpie to outline the outer lines as well as the short dividing lines. With the template complete, I was ready to start making decorations. I used a combination of oil-based gel food color and sifted powdered food colors to color white melting wafers like you see here. I was inspired by a creator whose TikTok is called Practical Peculiarities to try out using brown sugar to make candy melt decorations. I put a bunch of brown sugar into a large glass baking dish and pressed it down into a flat layer. I plastic wrapped a few of the game pieces that are stationary on the board and pressed them into the brown sugar. I also used a bowl filled with brown sugar for the top part of the spinner. After pressing the items into the brown sugar and carefully removing them, I added green melting wafers to fill in the pieces that are green and white melting wafers for the parts that are white. After letting the pieces set for quite a while, I used a spoon to carefully pry the pieces out of the brown sugar. The brown sugar became super hard and crusty and stuck to the top of the candy melts, so I have some troubleshooting to do if I decide to use this technique in the future. After I got off as much brown sugar as I could and I saw that there was still a lot stuck to the top, I decided to put the pieces in water and try my best to clean off as much of the brown sugar as possible. After each piece was thoroughly dried, I set them aside to start working on the game board. Using a combination of colored melting wafers and food brushes, as well as my template flipped upside down and under a piece of parchment paper, I got to work on the longest part of this project. I started by adding light gray along the sides of the path, just like in the classic game board. Then I began to fill in the path starting with the red spots since there are only a few of those. Next, I filled in the rest of the path with this golden yellow candy melt color. I then decided that I wanted to outline the gray melts and dark green melts. Following that, I also filled in most of the rest of the game board with light green melts and a little bit of dark green melts as well. I was very nervous about flipping it over, but using a couple of large baking sheets, I was successful and able to start adding the black dividing lines as well as adding the words using black candy melts and a fine food brush. While this part did take a super long time, I felt like I was in more control over writing the words using this technique rather than utilizing something else like a piping bag. Finally, once all of the spots were labeled and the melts were completely set, I carefully and quickly flipped the game board over once again and added a layer of chocolate melts along the back. I was nervous about the game board breaking when transferring it to the brownie slab, so I wanted to make it a little bit thicker to prevent possible structural issues. Before we finish decorating this birthday cake, if you are enjoying this video, then please make sure to hit that like button, click subscribe, and ring the bell to be notified about my latest video. Before we can assemble everything, we have to finish the final decorations. I didn't like the way the candy melt pieces looked after the brown sugar and washing them off, so I used a food brush and some more melting wafers to completely cover the top of the pieces. I used a fluffier brush for the green melt pieces because it gave them more of a grassy texture that works really well for the board. Once the green melts were set, I carefully added some of the golden yellow melts for the parts of the path that were going over top of these pieces. I tapped them on the counter to let the melt settle and smooth out and finally let them completely set. Then, once again, I added the words to complete these path pieces. The top of the spinner was delicate and ended up breaking in a few pieces, but using some white melting wafers, I got everything glued together, let those melt set, and then used a food brush to completely cover the top in white melting melting wafers. Unfortunately, I had bigger plans to make the top look exactly like the top of the traditional spinner, but due to time constraints, it resulted in me not being able to add the rainbow colors or numbers. After trimming parts of the spinner's green base a couple of times, I used white melting wafers to glue the top to the bottom. One final piece before everything comes together, I decided to use this fun bubble balloon numbers and letters mold to make a happy birthday sign to add an extra special touch. I mixed together a combination of dark chocolate melting wafers, some crispy rice cereal, and some unflavored popping candy, and then carefully added it to the mold, tapped the mold on the counter to remove air bubbles, removed excess and smoothed the back, and finally let them completely set. After removing them from the mold, I used a fluffy brush to add a generous amount of edible gold luster dust to the letters and numbers. Finally, it's time to assemble. We start with adding a little bit of candy melts to the base of our cake board. This is to glue the brownie to the board. Then we add our caramel brownie slab and some melting wafers on top of that so we can glue the game board to the top of the caramel. The melts did set a bit quickly because the caramel and brownie were really cold, so I used my kitchen torch to just very lightly remelt those melts. I decided to flip the brownie slab onto the back of the game board and then use the large baking sheet to flip everything right side up. Now we can add all of our finishing touches. I started by adding some melting wafers in the corners and then immediately adding the candy melt hills. Next, we add some more melting wafers and glue down our spinner in the middle of the board. Then I placed the happy birthday balloon pieces on top of the board to see where exactly I wanted to place them, but I didn't glue them down just yet. Using my biggest fluffy brush and some inspiration from the classic board, I added green melts around the entire perimeter of the board to look like the tops of trees. I actually really liked the way that these trees turned out, and I felt like they brought the final details together really nicely. Using a little bit of candy melts, we carefully glued down the gold balloon letters and numbers. For a few of the spots on the path, I also added some themed chunky sprinkles and even a jelly bean for some extra fun details. Honestly, I was a bit annoyed that I couldn't finish the spinner the way I wanted to, but I knew I needed to add something else to it. So I used my kitchen torch to very gently remelt the top of the white melts, and then I generously sprinkled this really pretty glittery sugar sprinkle mix on the top. And here is our completed custom Game of Life birthday cake. While it didn't turn out exactly as I had planned, I'm still really happy with the final result, and I definitely learned a lot during the process. The best part is that my sister absolutely loved it and had fun looking at all of the steps on the path that were a mixture of fun memories, meaningful moments, and inside jokes. What do you think of this Game of Life inspired birthday cake? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Thank you so much for joining me today, foodie friends. I'll see you next time for another yummy adventure.